So it began after my dad, your grandfather, died. Your Uncle Eric was the executor of both my mom and dad's estate. And he went through all of Dad's papers and everything. And we knew that he had kept a diary of his journey and the march from Poland into Germany, but we'd never seen it before. Your grandfather had had the diary typed up by one of his secretaries at the bank. So that was sent to me sometime in 1999 or early 2000. I went down a 2-week rabbit hole with Google Maps trying to figure out where he went. And the result of that is this map of all the places that he stopped. And this is the beginning in Schubin, Poland. And that's the ending point in Hammelburg, Germany. And then not that long ago, I got a Facebook message from a guy in France, Michael Remy, who had found this map online. I didn't know that it was public. He lives in Remiremont, France, and that's near where your grandfather was captured. And he said, if you ever come, I'll give you a tour. And so it was like, well, now I really want to do this. So Dad's service, he was sent overseas to Northern Ireland to train there. And then he was in the invasion of Africa. And the funny thing was, he wrote sort of an outline of his service, and he wrote 2 pages. One of the interesting things was that he came very close to being captured 2 years earlier. He was in North Africa, but he was sent to pick up 3 new cannons for his outfit. And while he was gone, the Germans surrounded his outfit and they took prisoner. And I didn't know until I read that when he got to Schubin, he was reunited with friends that had been captured in Africa. He was in the invasion of southern France. The invasion of southern France was August 15th, 1944. He fought up this area that is called the Vosges Mountains, and he was captured on September 21st, 1944. They were supposed to cross the Mosel River, and it was a moonless night, and obviously they're not going to be going around with flashlights. But his unit got lost, and the sunrise was coming, and so Dad said, we've got to cross here. So they crossed, and they crossed into a big open field, and on both sides were German machine gun placements. So the Germans waited till a group got across and then got them in crossfire. And so Dad was wounded in the thigh, and his adjutant was killed. And there were 12 other Americans that were killed during that. But Dad was able to get on the radio and let the rest of the battalion know not to cross there because the Germans were ready for them.
Okay, welcome. That's Sunday, January 28th, yes. And we are in Schubin.
And this is the monument to the camp at Schubin. And this is where the journey begins, and this is the map of the Long March that my dad was a part of.
Right.
And so to follow Ziggy's advice and the Chinese parable, this journey is going to start with at least 1 or 2 steps with me.
Okay, so let's continue. Let's begin.
And so the trip was organized to be what I would call semi-backwards. I flew to Poland first and did his long march, which was from Schubin, Poland, which is where his camp, Oflag 64. Oflag was what they called camps that were just for officers. And beginning on January the 21st, 1945, they did this march. The winter of 1945 was one of the worst on record. They marched to Parchim, Germany. Some marched all the way to Hammelburg. At Parchim, Dad got on a train, 14 boxcars with other prisoners, and then they took the train to Hammelburg. So north of Hammelburg, about 400 kilometers, is Limburg, Germany. And that's where Dad was interrogated by the Gestapo for 8 days after he was captured. And so that's where I went after Hammelburg. And then after Limburg, I went to Remiremont, France. And that was, in essence, the beginning part where Dad was captured. The march began on January 21st, 1945. And the reason that the march started was the Soviets were fighting the Germans on the Eastern Front, and they were 2 to 3 days away from Schuben. And the last thing the Germans wanted was to get captured by the Russians. That was a death sentence because of how horribly the Germans had treated the Russians. The Germans called Slavs Untermensch, subhumans, and they were only one step above Jews. And that's why they unloaded the camp and made this journey so they could get back into Germany. When I landed in Poland, I flew into Gdansk, which is on the Baltic, and Gdansk used to be part of Germany pre-World War II, and that was called Danzig. And so I landed in Gdansk, and then I was picked up by my first guide there. His name was Zbigniew, but his nickname was Ziggy.
So this was Mariusz, who was your guide for
the day that we were in Schuben at Auflag 64. As a hobby, he is the president of the museum in Schuben about Auflag 64. So they put me in touch with him. And so I rearranged dates of my trip because he has a job during the week. He only does tours on weekends. It was so interesting. We arrived in Schuben at like 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning. Mariusz had us meet him at the train station because that's where Dad would have arrived. Well, the train station is largely abandoned, overgrown. It was cold, it was raining, it was windy, and I literally could feel like Dad saying, "This is bad. I wanted you to feel this. It was worse." And so it was this deserted platform. It felt haunted. Yeah. We walked around, and it wasn't until the next day that I realized the train depot is derelict, except there's an apartment on the second floor. So if you can imagine looking at like an abandoned building that's falling apart, then you look up and there are white lace curtains in the windows. Trains don't stop there anymore. And so it really feels abandoned and overgrown and deserted. The interesting thing is, before the Second World War, the area that became the prison camp was a reform school for boys. And after the Second World War, it has now gone back to becoming a reform school for boys. And it's more of a youth detention area, like a prison. So for most of the tour, I had to set my passport ahead of time, my passport number, because we had to go in through the detention center. A number of the buildings no longer exist. Probably the one that was the most famous was called the White House, and that has now been taken down. There's an apartment building there. But the building that Mariusz is trying to turn into a museum, they called it the Tin House. And Brits called canned goods tins. I've got a tin of beans rather than a can of beans. The Tin House was where they kept all of the food for the prisoners, and that is the museum now. And so that's where we spent most of the day. But Mariusz got out things to show us, and probably the most meaningful thing to me, although it didn't belong to Dad, soldiers were often given small Bibles, and some of them had metal covers to them. Dad had that in his pocket when he was captured, and when he was wounded, and then the Germans got him, he said that in the middle of all of this, one of the things he didn't think anything about, he just felt a bullet hit the Bible. And the Bible maybe saved his life.
So the next destination was Parkhim.
So that's where he and I don't know how many others, but he says in his diary they were loaded into 14 boxcars. And if you think of all of the documentaries that you've seen of Jews or soldiers in boxcars, that's exactly what it was like. We were met by a local guide, and his first name was Johannes, 84 years old, and he was 6 years old when the camp at Hammelburg was liberated. In other words, that's when Dad was freed. The one thing that I had wanted to do, Dad said in his diary that the last part of the trip was they had to walk from the train depot in Hammelburg up the hill to what's called Hammelburg Lager. That's where the camp was, off Log 13B. I wanted to walk that. Before I went, I read up on Hammelburg and the POW camp. Starting in the First World War, Hammelburg was an active German army training facility. And it was an active German training facility during the Second World War, even with the camp there, and it is still a German army training base. What my study was, okay, you can go to the gate and you can look in, but you can't get on the base because it's restricted army personnel only. I found out Sebastian had gone through all of his contacts with travel agents and everything. Hannes knew everybody in town, and he knew somebody in the Directorate of Information. He got us on the base. We did walk most of the way up to the base, 2/3 of the way. We took the car because we had a certain time that we had to be there for the tour that they were going to let us in. So on the base, we were given a private tour of the museum on the base. And the incredible things, there was a photograph of John Waters. He was a good friend of Dad's. And they were in camp together, and General Patton was his father-in-law. And I'll go into this later, but I have since connected with John Waters' son, and he's called George Patton Waters. He's named after Patton. We got on the base, we got a tour of the museum with these two Army sergeants, and then a tour of the garage where they keep all of their vehicles. The main guy that gave us the tour, his name was Schubert and so I said to him, I said, well, you know, and it was, to that day was Franz Schubert's birthday. And he just looked at me and he just went, he was Austrian. And like, didn't count. And so after the tour of the base, it was really not far from dinner time, came back to the hotel and kind of relaxed for a little bit. And then Hannes joined us for dinner. And at the end of the meal, it was obvious he became emotional and I did too. And it was just that he felt a real sense of connection. He said, you must come back. You must bring your family. That was very special. The next day is when we drove from Hammelburg to Limburg. Limburg is one of the places that I would go back to. The town is beautiful. It's like Disneyland, only it's real. And all of these buildings with timber framing from the 14th and 15th century. And then there's a sad story behind that. There was a camp outside of Limburg. On December 23rd, 1944, there was an air raid by the British. And December 23rd in the German calendar, Christian calendar, is a special, not holiday, but a special day like the day before Christmas Eve. And the way that the British did their bombings, they did them at night. And what they would do is there was a famous British plane called a Mosquito. And it had two very powerful engines and was made from wood, no sort of armor on it at all. And they were fast until the Germans built the first jet fighter. There was no German plane that could catch a mosquito. And what would happen is the mosquitoes would fly over an area that was to be bombed, and they would drop flares. So when the bombers came over, they knew that's where you drop the bombs. Well, December 23rd was very windy, and they dropped the flares, and it blew onto the prison camp. They killed 70 Americans. The town was saved. So I was driven to where the camp was, and Dad was probably in that camp. Dad was only in Limburg for 8 days when he was questioned by the Gestapo, and so he was probably at night at this camp. And everything I've read was because it was a major area for interrogating prisoners, it was constantly in flux, and so the prison camp was a mess. It is now a German army, like motor pool depot where they keep vehicles and things like that. And then next to it, and it was back then, is a prison. And it still is a German prison now. The most interesting thing in Limburg that had to do with Dad was the Gestapo headquarters looked fairly nice. Yellow with a green roof and green shutters. And that's where the Gestapo headquarters was. Well, it's now apartments. The last night that we were there, Sebastian, we were walking around town looking at various and sundry things. And Sebastian said, I'm just going to ring one of the apartments and see if they'll come out. Nobody answered. And as we started to walk away, the gates opened and there was a woman that drove her car in. Obviously, she lived there. So we ran in the gate. We stayed far away from the car, and she had that look on her face like the next thing is, I'm calling the police. Sebastian explained why we were there. And it turned out that she and her husband owned the building. The apartment that is theirs was the Gestapo headquarters. And she wouldn't take us into her apartment, which was just fine, but they took us into the lobby. The floor was all black marble, and that would have been there with the Gestapo. There was a very prominent Jewish community in Limburg, and there are ruins of a mikveh, and that was where women went to do a cleansing bath, usually around the time of their menstrual cycles. But the other interesting thing that I hadn't brought up before, and it's all over Germany, they have what are called stumbling stones. They're about 8 inches square. They're made out of brass, and on each one there is a name of a Jew that was in this particular area. This Jew lived in this house and was taken on this date. They're set into the cobblestones. They're there to remind Germans that, this happened. We were complicit in some of this. Sebastian had to go. Cem drove me to Remiremont and checked into the hotel there and made connection with my guide in Remiremont, Michael Remy. His job is that he provides props and workable vehicles for World War II German and French movies. So the first thing he did was we went to one of his garages in town. He has a restored 1944 American Jeep. No top, no doors. It was 35. We went out to this farm in this Jeep. This was not Disneyland. Guys in boots up to their, calves and shit on them, and it was real. And this farm has 4 or 5 buildings that they keep restored World War II vehicles in. They restored and have a running Sherman tank. One of the photos is of me in a French motorcycle with a sidecar, and I'm sitting in there with a machine gun. There were these 3 men, Robert, Guy, and I think Stefan was the third. Robert and Guy, they are the head mechanics. These guys restore all these vehicles, and they were so excited to have me see all of this and that my dad had been a part of this. So they showed me all over the place with these vehicles. Then they took me to their collection. And the collection borders on hoarding. Here we have canteens, and there would be not 3, but 50 of them. And here we have French mess kits, not 3 of them, but 25. So then after all of that, they took me down to their kitchen. Wood floor, a table, rickety would be a pleasant description, oil tablecloth on it. And I made those photographs, those postcards with the picture of me and Dad and Eric in 1968, all of us in our uniform. And there was a shelf behind the table. And they put Dad's picture up on the shelf. That was really cool. And they broke out champagne. And I hadn't had lunch. They were so sweet. So as I left, Robert came running back out, and he gave me a painting, and I think it's of a bunker. It was like, you gave us so much, and I have to give you this. So the next day, on our way to the crossing of the Mosel River, we stopped at the home of Camille, who is a friend of Michael's. He's 91 years old, spoke no English, wonderful smile. He had translated Dad's service record into French so I could have that. And the day of the crossing that Dad's regiment did, he was 12 years old. And after Dad had crossed and the fight had finished, Camille and a couple of his friends went to where the crossing had taken place, and they looked over in the meadow, and here is an arm coming out of a trench waving at them, and it was a wounded American that the Germans had left for dead. So Camille and his friends waded across the Mosel River chest deep in October, and they carried this man over their heads back to the French side of the Mosel River. And this man, Stephen Burns, survived the war and has come back to see Camille with his wife. And that's when Camille broke out the champagne and the sugar cookies. And for the second time in 2 days, I had champagne before lunch. So after champagne and sugar cookies, we got back in the Jeep and we headed out to where the crossing actually occurred. And what's amazing is that there are all of these wonderful plaques along the way that describe the way that the Americans came and where the crossing occurred. And there are markers that have been put up by French to show the actual way that the Americans went. We got out to where the crossing occurred, and there's a moss-covered bridge there. Mikhail explained to me that the Americans had 50 caliber machine guns on either side of the bridge to cover the crossing. The crossing happened very near to sunrise. And so when the men crossed the river in the wrong place, Dad was in that lead group, the Germans had machine guns on either side of this meadow. And the meadow was big, 2, 3, 4 football fields wide. And Dad got caught and his men got caught in crossfire. His adjutant was killed. Dad was wounded in the thigh, and 12 other men were killed, but Dad was able to get in contact with the rest of the regiment so they wouldn't cross. And that was when Dad was captured. Then we went up to the point, and there is an old mill there where the other 2 regiments, not Dad's regiments, crossed. That was the place they were all supposed to cross. And there is a monument there to the Texas 36th and the 3 regiments that went across. Yeah, the next day was my last full day in France, and it began by Mikhail meeting me at the hotel, and we drove out to the area where Dad was captured, and we were met by Heidi, who was a newspaper reporter for the Remiremont paper, and she interviewed me. She spoke less English than Mikhail, and so there was a lot of drawing pictures, nodding, making hand gestures. And she had never been out to this site, and she lives there. And so she interviewed me. We looked at the site with her, and then she left, and Mikhail, he asked, would you like to see if we can see the meadow where your dad was captured? And I said, absolutely. And he said, we probably won't be able to get on the meadow because it's a private farm, but we can at least go there. So we drove. We had to drive, I suppose, 20 miles to get across a bridge over to where the meadow was. And we pulled into this farm, and here came this farmer. in a John Deere tractor with a front loader full of cow shit. And Mikhail jumped out of the Jeep and went to talk to him, and it turned out that this was his grandfather's farm. And his grandfather was there the day that crossing had taken place, and he was very sweet and said, of course you can go out to the meadow. So we got in the Jeep and drove out into the meadow so I could stand in the area where Dad was captured. And I suppose the strangest thing that you'll see in pictures of me, I'm just smiling. And it just felt like a very deep connection to my dad rather than it being a depressing situation. Then after time in that meadow, we drove to the cemetery nearby. It's the American Cemetery of War Dead. And it's I hate to use the word typical, but just lines and rows of crosses and a very few stars of David. And we found the area where at least one man was killed in that crossing, and I have no idea if this was his orderly. There were 12 other men that were killed that day, but it was really very special to be there. And at the entrance to the cemetery, there is this huge mosaic of the Southern France campaign. And that was very moving. And that was my last day in the Remiremont. And I went back to the hotel and just sort of started to go through photos and process everything that I'd seen. And the next morning I came back home.
Amazing grace, how sweet